There are wounds that never close, only quiet down. Ilara carried hers like a second skin, invisible to strangers, unbearable in silence. She worked double shifts at a crumbling hospital on the edge of the city, where the fluorescent bulbs flickered and the walls smelled of antiseptic and despair. Her hands were steady when she cleaned wounds, when she held the dying, when she whispered comfort to those who had none left to give. But when she returned to her small apartment, when the door clicked shut behind her, those same hands trembled. Her younger brother was dying. Not quickly, not mercifully. A slow decay of the lungs, a rare condition the doctors named with cold precision but offered no cure for. The treatments were experimental, expensive, impossible. She had sold everything, her mother's rings, her father's watch, the childhood home that still smelled of bread and laughter. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. At night, she sat by his bedside and counted his breaths. 23, 24, 25. Each one a small miracle, each one a reminder that miracles run out. She had gone to the banks. They turned her away. She had gone to charities. They gave her pamphlets and sympathetic smiles. She had gone to loan sharks who operated out of backroom bars, men with gold teeth and dead eyes. They had laughed at her collateral, a dying boy and a nurse's salary. One of them had leaned close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and said, "Maybe you got something else to offer, sweetheart." She left before he could finish the thought. But desperation is a patient hunter. It waits. It watches. It knows that eventually everyone breaks. *** before we go on. Tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. ***. 3 weeks later, a woman approached her outside the hospital. She was elegant in a way that didn't belong to that neighborhood. Silk blouse, leather gloves, heels that clicked with authority. She knew Ilara's name. She knew about her brother. She knew about the debt. "There's someone who can help you," the woman said. Her voice was smooth, practiced. "Someone who makes problems disappear." Ilara should have walked away, should have known that help like that always comes with a price written in blood. But when you're drowning, you don't ask questions about the hand that pulls you up. You just grab it. The woman gave her an address, a time, a warning that felt more like a promise. Don't be late. He doesn't offer twice. That night, Ilara stood in front of her mirror and barely recognized herself. The exhaustion had carved her face into something harder, older. Her eyes held a desperation that frightened her. She thought about her brother's laugh, the way it used to fill rooms before the sickness stole his voice. She thought about the sound of his breathing, growing shallower each day. She went to the address. The building was unremarkable from the outside, a renovated warehouse in the industrial district, all clean lines and dark windows. But the moment she stepped through the door, the air changed. Thicker, heavier, the kind of quiet that comes before violence. 2 men flanked the entrance. They didn't speak, didn't search her. They simply watched, as if they could see straight through to the desperation pulsing beneath her skin. She was led through a corridor lined with closed doors, each one a secret she didn't want to know. At the end, a set of double doors opened into an office that looked like it belonged in a different world. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, paintings that probably cost more than her entire life. And behind the desk, him. She would later struggle to describe that first moment. Not because she couldn't remember, but because words felt inadequate. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in the seconds it took for her to cross the threshold. He wore his authority like other men wore cologne, subtle, expensive, impossible to ignore. His name was Dante Moetti. She didn't know it yet, but that name held weight in the city's shadows. It opened doors and closed mouths. It made strong men weak and weak men disappear. "Sit," he said. Not a request. She Saturday. He studied her for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You need money." "Yes." "How much?" She told him. The number was staggering, obscene. It would take her 10 years to earn that much, maybe more. He didn't flinch. And what are you offering in return? This was the moment. The cliff's edge. The point of no return. I don't know, she admitted, and the honesty tasted like defeat. I have nothing, but I'll do anything. A small smile touched his lips. Not warm, not cruel, just interested. Anything is a dangerous word, Elara. He said her name like he'd known it his whole life. People who say it rarely understand what they are promising. I understand. Do you? He leaned forward, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, a test, maybe, or warning. I could ask you to lie for me, steal for me, kill for me, and you'd do it. She met his gaze, held it. For my brother, yes. The room fell silent. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Footsteps echoed and faded. Then Dante stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. He was tall, and she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I'll give you the money, he said. All of it. No interest. No repayment plan. Hope flared so bright it hurt. But, he continued, and the hope dimmed, you belong to me now. You work for me. You live where I tell you to live. You do what I tell you to do. And you tell no one, not your friends, not your colleagues, not even your brother, who I am or what you've agreed to. For how long? Until I say otherwise. It was a cage made of cash and desperation. But cages, she would learn, sometimes keep the monsters out as much as they keep you in. She extended her hand. Deal. He took it. His grip was firm, warm, absolute. The money will be in your account by morning, he said. Pack your things tonight. Someone will collect you tomorrow at noon. She wanted to ask questions, wanted to know what she'd just sold herself into. But the words stuck in her throat, and by the time she found them again, she was already back on the street, the night air cold against her skin. When she checked her phone, there was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, you made the right choice. Asterisk. She wasn't sure she believed that. But belief, like so many other luxuries, was something she could no longer afford. The money appeared at dawn, transferred in a single, impossible sum. Elara stared at the numbers on her phone screen until they blurred. She had expected complications, wire transfers that took days, paperwork that drowned her in questions. But this was instant, seamless, as if the entire banking system bent to accommodate one man's word. She called the hospital immediately, spoke to specialists who had previously looked at her with pity and now listened with sudden attention. The treatments were scheduled, the medications ordered. Her brother cried when she told him, his frail shoulders shaking with relief that felt like resurrection. How? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, kissed his forehead, and lied. I found a way. Later, back at her apartment, she packed. It didn't take long. Her life fit into 2 suitcases and a backpack. Clothes, photographs, the small things that tether a person to who they used to be. She left behind her lease, her old routines, the version of herself who believed in fair trades and honest work. At noon, a black car arrived. The driver was silent, professional. He opened the door for her, loaded her bags, and drove without asking for directions. The city rolled past her window, familiar streets giving way to unfamiliar ones, the buildings growing taller, then sparser, then replaced entirely by iron gates and long driveways hidden behind walls. They stopped at an estate that looked like it had been stolen from another century. Stone facade, sprawling gardens, windows that watched like eyes. The gates opened automatically, as if the house itself recognized her arrival. Inside, everything was controlled. The temperature, the lighting, the silence that felt more like presence than absence. A woman met her in the foyer, older, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and an expression that gave nothing away. Miss Elara, she said, the title sounding both formal and faintly mocking. I'm Mrs. Hale. I manage the household. You'll stay in the East Wing, 3rd floor. Your meals will be provided. You're not to enter Mr. Moetti's private rooms without invitation. What am I supposed to do here? Mrs. Hale's expression didn't change. Wait. And so she waited. The room they gave her was larger than her entire apartment had been. 4-poster bed, walk-in closet, bathroom with heated floors and a tub deep enough to drown in. The windows overlooked the gardens, where hedges were trimmed into geometric perfection and fountains murmured to themselves. For 3 days, she saw no one but Mrs. Hale and the silent staff who brought her food and collected her dishes. No instructions arrived. No explanations. Just the slow, suffocating weight of isolation wrapped in luxury. She tried to leave once, on the second day. Walked down the stairs, across the foyer, toward the front door. A man stepped into her path before she reached it, one of the guards from Dante's office, though she hadn't seen him arrive. Going somewhere, miss? Just outside. Mr. Moetti prefers you remain in the house for now. For your safety. Safety. The word tasted like iron, like the bars of a cage painted gold. She returned to her room and stood at the window, watching the sun set over the gardens. Somewhere beyond those walls, her brother was getting treatment. Somewhere beyond those walls, people lived free. But freedom, she was learning, was another luxury she'd traded away. On the 4th night, Dante came to her. There was no knock, no warning. The door simply opened, and he stepped through, dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked tired, though it was the kind of tired that sharpened rather than dulled. You've been avoiding the dinner invitations, he said, closing the door behind him. I didn't know I was invited. Mrs. Hale told you. Twice. Elara crossed her arms. I'm not hungry. He moved further into the room, his presence filling it in a way that felt both intrusive and strangely natural. He stopped by the window, looking out at the same view she'd been staring at for days. You're angry, he observed. I'm a prisoner. You're protected. Same thing, from where I'm standing. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition, as if he understood the difference between safety and captivity better than she did. There are people in this city who would hurt you to get to me, he said quietly. People who would use your brother as leverage, who would make you wish you'd never heard my name. Keeping you here isn't cruelty, Elara. It's necessity. You could have told me that. Would you have believed me? She had no answer for that. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of him, something clean and dark, like rain on stone. You agreed to work for me. I'm telling you now, your job is to stay alive. Stay here. Stay safe. That's all I'm asking. For how long? Until the threat passes. And if it doesn't? His jaw tightened. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. He left before she could argue further, the door closing with a soft click that sounded too much like finality. That night, she dreamed of locked doors and keys she couldn't reach. The days bled together after that. She established routines because routines kept her sane. Morning walks through the gardens under the watchful eyes of guards who pretended not to follow her. Afternoons in the library where the books were too old and too expensive to provide comfort. Evenings in her room where she spoke to her brother on the phone and pretended everything was fine. He was getting better. The treatments were working. His voice grew stronger with each call, and the knowledge that her sacrifice was saving him was the only thing that kept her from screaming at the walls. Dante appeared sporadically, sometimes at dinner, sometimes in the hallway, once in the library where she'd fallen asleep over a book and woken to find him sitting across from her, reading in silence. You don't have to watch me, she said, rubbing her eyes. I'm not watching you. I'm reading. In the same room I happened to be in. He glanced up, and something almost like amusement crossed his face. Would you prefer I read somewhere else? I'd prefer to know why I'm really here. The amusement faded. I told you. You told me about threats and protection, but you never said who, or why, or what you want from me beyond just existing in your house like some kind of ghost. He closed his book, set it aside, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped, eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Someone is coming for me," he said, voice low. "Someone I wronged a long time ago. They know I don't have weaknesses. No wife, no children, no family left to threaten. But they are smart. They know that people like me, we build empires out of control. And the moment we care about something, we become vulnerable. So you brought me here to, what? Make yourself look vulnerable." "No." He held her gaze. "I brought you here because I didn't want them to find you." The words hung between them, heavy with implications she wasn't ready to examine. "Why would they look for me?" "Because I paid your debt. Because my people made inquiries at your hospital. Because in this world, attention is the same as connection, and connection is the same as liability." She felt cold suddenly, despite the warmth of the room. "So I'm bait. You're collateral, but the kind I intend to protect." There was a difference, she supposed. A thin one, drawn in intention she couldn't verify and promises she had no choice but to trust. He stood, picked up his book. "Dinner is at 7. I'd appreciate it if you joined me." It wasn't a command. Not quite. But it wasn't a request either. "Why?" she asked. He paused at the door. "Because I eat alone too often," he said, "and I find that I'm tired of it." Then he was gone, leaving her in the library with more questions than answers and the uncomfortable realization that her captor was far more human than she'd wanted him to be. She went to dinner that night, and the night after, and the one after that, and slowly, against her better judgment, the cage began to feel less like a prison and more like a refuge from a world she hadn't known was hunting her. Time moved differently in that house. Days stretched and contracted according to their own logic. An hour in the garden could feel like minutes, while 10 minutes in her room waiting for nothing could feel like years. Ilara marked the passage not by calendars but by small changes, the way the morning light shifted across her floor, the slow bloom of roses outside her window, the gradual softening of Mrs. Hale's expression when she thought no one was watching. And Dante. He was the constant variable, appearing and disappearing according to patterns she couldn't predict. Some mornings she'd find him in the breakfast room, reading newspapers in 3 languages while his coffee went cold. Other mornings he was absent entirely, gone before dawn to places he never named, returning late with shadows under his eyes and blood on his knuckles that he washed away before anyone else could see. But she saw. The dinners became ritual. 7 o'clock. Every evening he was home. At first they ate in silence, the clink of silverware and the distant sounds of the household the only interruption. But silence, she discovered, was a space that eventually demanded filling. "Tell me about your brother," he said one night, cutting into something Mrs. Hale had prepared with too much butter and not enough concern for cardiac health. Ilara looked up, surprised by the question. Personal inquiries felt out of character, though she was beginning to realize she didn't actually know his character at all. "What do you want to know?" "Why you love him enough to sell yourself to a stranger." The bluntness should have offended her. Instead, it felt like relief, an acknowledgement of the thing neither of them had named directly. "He's the only family I have left," she said simply. "Our parents died when I was 19. Car accident. Very sudden. Very final. I raised him from 13 to now. Taught him to tie his shoes, to drive, to ask girls out without stammering. And then he got sick, and I realized that all the love in the world couldn't save him. But money could." Dante was quiet for a moment, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. That must have been a terrible realization. It was clarifying. And now he's getting better. The doctors say another 6 months of treatment and he might achieve full remission. Might. Nothing's guaranteed. But it's more hope than we had before. Before me, you mean? She met his eyes across the table. Yes, before you. He set down his fork, picked up his wine glass, studied the dark liquid as if it held answers. "I don't do this often," he said finally. Help people. I've noticed. I do it even less without expecting something in return. You got something in return. You got me. His eyes lifted to hers, and there was something in them she couldn't name. Not desire, exactly. Not possession. Something more complicated, more dangerous. I'm beginning to think I got more than I bargained for. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They finished dinner in a different kind of silence, not empty, but full of things neither was ready to speak aloud. Asterisk asterisk, if this story has already found a place in your heart, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below for more stories that stay long after they end at asterisk asterisk. The weeks accumulated. Her brother's health improved in increments that felt like miracles. The estate became familiar, its rhythms as predictable as breathing. She learned the names of the staff: Juan the gardener who sang to the roses, Teresa who cooked with the kind of precision that suggested a past in finer kitchens, Robert the head of security who nodded at her each morning with something approaching respect. She learned, too, about Dante's world through careful observation and overheard conversations. He ran an empire built on imports and exports, on transactions that happened in boardrooms and backrooms alike. Legal, mostly, but with the kind of legal that required lawyers who didn't ask questions and accountants who knew when to look away. He was feared. She saw it in the way visitors tensed in his presence, in the careful modulation of voices when they spoke to him, in the deference that bordered on terror. But he was also respected, in the way that powerful men are respected when their power is tempered by something resembling honor. He didn't lie, she noticed, didn't make promises he wouldn't keep. When he said something would happen, it happened. When he gave his word, it held. It made trusting him easier, and that terrified her. One night, she woke to sounds, raised voices, rapid footsteps, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot that seemed to split the darkness like lightning. She sat up, heart hammering, listened. More footsteps, shouting, then silence, thick and ominous. She should have stayed in her room, locked the door, hidden. But something pulled her up, pulled her toward the sounds, toward the danger she'd been kept from understanding. The hallway was empty when she opened her door. The lights were dimmed for night, casting long shadows that moved when she did. She moved toward the stairs, bare feet silent on expensive carpet. More voices below. Hush! Urgent. She reached the top of the stairs and looked down into chaos. Men in dark clothes, weapons she didn't want to name, and in the center of it all, Dante. His shirt was torn. Blood streaked his forearm. But his voice was steady, commanding, cutting through panic with the precision of a blade. Secure the perimeter. Check every entrance. I want names by morning. He turned, and his eyes found hers across the space. For a moment, everything else fell away. The armed men, the blood, the violence that had invaded the sanctuary he'd promised her. Ilara. Not loud, but it carried. Go back to your room. She didn't move. His jaw tightened. He said something to the man beside him, then crossed the floor in long strides and climbed the stairs to where she stood frozen. Up close, she could see the cut above his eyebrow, the split lip, the way his hands were still steady despite whatever had just happened. Are you hurt? She asked, before he could speak. The question seemed to surprise him. No. You're bleeding. It's not mine. The words should have frightened her, should have reminded her exactly what kind of man she was living with. Instead, all she felt was a strange, unwelcome relief that the blood belonged to someone else. What happened? Someone tried to get in. To you. His eyes held hers. To you. The world tilted slightly. What? They didn't get far, but they tried. He reached out, and his hand, warm, solid, still carrying traces of violence, touched her shoulder, not restraining, anchoring. This is why you stay inside. This is why I need you to trust me. I do trust you, she heard herself say, and realized with a shock that it was true. Something changed in his expression. Softened, hardened. both at once. "Go back to your room," he said again, quieter this time. "Lock the door. I'll come check on you when this is finished." She nodded, turned, made it 3 steps before his voice stopped her. "Elara." She looked back. "I won't let them hurt you." It was a promise, and she believed it. She returned to her room, locked the door as instructed, and sat on the edge of her bed listening to the sounds of men cleaning up violence below. The adrenaline drained slowly, leaving her cold and shaking. An hour passed, maybe 2, then a knock. "It's me," Dante's voice, muffled by the door. She opened it. He stood in the hallway, cleaned up now, the blood washed away, wearing fresh clothes. But the exhaustion was new, written in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he held himself. "You're safe," he said, as if that was the only thing that mattered. "Who were they?" "Competitors. People who think taking something from me will weaken me." "Will it?" He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know. I've never cared about something enough to find out." The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. "You should rest," she said finally, because she didn't know what else to say. He nodded, started to turn, stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, "for bringing this to you, for making you part of this. You saved my brother. That doesn't make this right." "No," she agreed, "but it makes it worth it." He studied her face as if trying to memorize it. Then he left, and she closed the door, and somewhere in the quiet that followed, she realized the cage had shifted again. It wasn't just keeping Hohen anymore. It was keeping him close, and she wasn't sure which was more dangerous. Security doubled after that night. New faces appeared, hard men with harder eyes who patrolled the grounds and stood at every entrance like statues carved from violence and vigilance. The estate became a fortress, and Elara its reluctant treasure. Dante changed too, though the shift was subtle. He was more present, his appearances less random and more deliberate. Breakfast became another ritual. He'd appear in the morning room with newspapers and coffee, sometimes fresh pastries that Teresa insisted on despite his protests, and they'd share the silence of early hours before the world demanded his attention. She learned about him in fragments, pieces he let slip when his guard was down. He'd grown up poor, he told her once, the kind of poor that leaves marks long after money fills the gaps. His father had been a dock worker who died young from lungs filled with asbestos and dreams unfulfilled. His mother had cleaned houses until her hands bled, then came home and cleaned her own. "She wanted more for me," he said, staring into his coffee as if it held memories. "Not this, specifically, but more." Would she be proud? He smiled, but it was the saddest smile Elara had ever seen. She'd be horrified, and then she'd make me dinner and tell me to be careful. When did she die? 10 years ago. Cancer. I was already what I am now. I paid for the best treatment, the best doctors. It wasn't enough. Some things money can't fix. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "That's why you helped me," Elara said softly. "With my brother." He looked up, and his eyes were raw in a way she'd never seen them. Maybe I just wanted to feel like I could fix something for once. The conversation stayed with her long after he left for his meetings, for the business that kept him absent in body even when he was present in thought. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if the blood he came home with would ever be his own. It was dangerous, this caring. She recognized it for what it was, tried to pull back. But caring, she was learning, wasn't something you could control through logic or self-preservation. The garden became her refuge. She spent hours there, walking the paths that Juan maintained with devotional precision. The roses were blooming now, heavy with scent and color, and she often sat on the stone bench near the fountain, listening to water and trying to remember who she'd been before all this. Dante found her there one afternoon. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path, recognized his gait, measured, purposeful, carrying weight that wasn't physical. "Mind if I join you?" She moved over on the bench, making space. He sat, and for a while they just existed together in the garden's peace, surrounded by beauty that someone else had cultivated. "I have to go away for a few days," he said eventually. "Business in the north. I need you to stay here, stay safe." "I always stay here." "I know, but this time it's different. This time I won't be here to." He trailed off, and she finished the thought he couldn't. "To protect me?" "Yes." She turned to look at him, really look at him. So the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clasped tight as if holding something back. "I'll be fine," she said. "You've turned this place into a fortress, and I've learned to be careful." "Careful isn't enough. Not with these people." "Then what do you want me to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, I want you to tell me that when I come back, you'll still be here." The request was simple. The emotion beneath it wasn't. "Where else would I go?" "Away. Free. Anywhere that isn't locked in my world." She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, the calluses on his palms at odds with his expensive clothes and cultivated authority. "I'll be here," she promised. He turned his hand, caught hers, held it with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. "Why?" he asked, voice rough. She could have said many things, could have mentioned her brother, the debt she still felt she owed, the practical reality of having nowhere else to go. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. "Because I want to be." His fingers tightened around hers. For a moment, she thought he might pull away, might retreat behind the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. Instead, he brought her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt like punctuation on a sentence they'd been writing together since that first night in his office. "When I get back," he said, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About why I'm terrified every time I leave you. About why I come home just to see if you're still here. About why keeping you safe has become more important than any deal I've ever made." Her breath caught. "Dante." "Not now. When I'm back. When I can think clearly and say it right." He released her hand, stood. "But I need you to know, you're not just someone I'm protecting anymore, Alara. You're someone I can't imagine not protecting." He left her in the garden, surrounded by roses and implications she wasn't ready to examine. But her hand burned where he'd kissed it, and her heart beat in rhythms that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something far more dangerous. ***, if you've ever felt torn between fear and love, you'll understand her. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below. Your support keeps stories like this alive. ***. He left at dawn 2 days later. She watched from her window as the cars pulled away, carrying him north to business she didn't understand and dangers she couldn't name. The estate felt emptier without him, as if his presence had been filling spaces she hadn't realized were hollow. Robert increased the guard rotations. Teresa cooked comfort food that Alara couldn't eat. Mrs. Hale hovered with uncharacteristic concern, finding excuses to check on her throughout the day. "He'll be back," the older woman said one evening, as if reading Alara's thoughts. "He always comes back." "How long have you worked for him?" 15 years. Since he was nothing but ambition and borrowed money. I watched him build all this." She gestured vaguely at the estate, but Alara understood she meant more than just the house. "And I've never seen him like this." "Like what?" Mrs. Hale's smile was small, knowing, human. The word lingered after she left. The first night without Dante, Alara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle around her, to the distant sounds of God's changing shifts, to the silence that felt too big. The second night was worse. The third night, she gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to the library, thinking books might fill the hours until dawn. She was curled in the leather chair, forcing her eyes across pages she wasn't absorbing, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Her heart jumped. She answered. "Alara." His voice, rough with exhaustion but alive, so alive. Did I wake you? No. I was reading. At 3 in the morning. I could ask you the same thing. She heard him breathe, heard the smile in his voice when he spoke again. I wanted to check on you. Make sure everything's okay. Everything's fine. Robert has enough guards here to repel an army. Good. Silence stretched between them, comfortable and charged all at once. I can't sleep, he admitted finally. These meetings, this business, all I can think about is getting back. To the estate. To you. The words hung in the space between his location and hers, bridging distance with honesty. Dante. I know. We'll talk when I'm home. But I needed you to hear it. Needed you to know. I know, she whispered. I know. They talked until the sky began to lighten, about nothing and everything. He told her about the men he was meeting, the demands and deflections. She told him about the roses blooming, about the book she wasn't really reading, about how the house felt wrong without him in it. When they finally hung up, dawn was breaking, and something between them had shifted again. Not broken, not built, just acknowledged. He came home 2 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, earlier than expected. She was in the garden when she heard the cars, and she told herself not to run, but her feet didn't listen. He met her on the front steps, and for a moment they just looked at each other, cataloguing changes that 3 days had carved. He looked tired, more shadow than man. But when he smiled, it was real. You're still here, he said. I promised, didn't I? He closed the distance between them, and his hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing her skin with reverence that stole her breath. We need to talk, he said. I know. But not yet. First I need to. He trailed off, searching for words, and she saved him from finding them by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, asking questions neither had dared voice. He answered by pulling her closer, by kissing her back with the kind of hunger that comes from denial finally breaking. It wasn't gentle, wasn't careful, but it was honest, and that mattered more. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. I was going to make a speech, he murmured. I don't need a speech. I was going to tell you that somewhere between protecting you and knowing you, I fell in love with you. Her heart stopped, stuttered, restarted. Dante. I was going to say that I know this isn't what you signed up for, that I have no right to ask for more than what we agreed. But I'm asking anyway. I'm asking if maybe you could stay not because you have to, but because you want to. Because this, he gestured between them, is more than a deal. More than protection. It's... She kissed him again, stopping the words because they weren't necessary. She could feel the truth of them in the way he held her, in the way his heart beat against hers, in the way 3 days apart had felt like drowning. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes to all of it. And somewhere in the garden, while Juan sang to the roses and the fountain murmured its secrets, the cage door opened. Not because she was leaving, but because she was choosing to stay. Love, Elara discovered, didn't make things simpler. If anything, it complicated everything, tangled the practical with the impossible, wove fear through joy until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Dante's wail didn't soften because they'd admitted what had been growing between them. If anything, the dangers sharpened, came into clearer focus now that she understood what she stood to lose. He tried to shield her still, kept the ugliest parts of his business behind closed doors and careful silences. But she saw more now, heard more, understood that the empire he'd built required constant maintenance, that power was a thing that needed feeding, that every decision he made carried weight she'd been spared from feeling. They established new rhythms. Mornings together over coffee, his hand finding haze across the table. Afternoons apart, him in his office, her in the garden or library. Evenings reunited over dinners that had become less about sustenance and more about stolen hours before the world demanded him back. Nights, though. Nights were theirs. He'd come to her room, or she'd find her way to his, and they'd lie together in darkness that felt safer than daylight. He'd tell her things he'd never told anyone, about the first man he'd killed, about the guilt that lived in his chest like a second heart, about the fear that loving her had made him weak in ways his enemies would exploit. She'd tell him about the years raising her brother alone, about the loneliness that had become so familiar she'd mistaken it for strength, about the terror of watching someone you loved die slowly while the world shrugged and asked for payment plans. They built something in those nights, not a future, exactly, because the future in his world was never guaranteed, but a present that felt solid enough to hold on to. Her brother was thriving. The treatments had worked better than anyone had dared hope, and the doctors were using words like remission and recovery with increasing confidence. He called her weekly, voice strong and full of plans, returning to school, maybe traveling, living the life she'd almost sold her soul to preserve. "When can I meet this mysterious benefactor?" he asked one evening, the question casual but weighted. "Soon," she lied, because the truth was too complicated and too dangerous. Dante had been clear. Her brother couldn't know. No one could. Not his name, not his business, not the fact that the money that saved him had come wrapped in violence and moral ambiguity. "He sounds like he cares about you," her brother said, misreading her silence for something romantic. "From the way you talk about him." "He does," she admitted, and it wasn't a lie. After they hung up, she found Dante in his office, bent over papers that looked like contracts but read like threats. He looked up when she entered, and the hardness in his eyes softened. "Your brother?" "Doing well. Asking questions I can't answer." He set down his pen. "You can tell him, if you want. Tell him everything." "You said." "I know what I said, but that was before. Before I realized keeping him in the dark means keeping part of you in the dark too. I won't ask you to choose between loving me and protecting him." She crossed to his desk, came around it, slid into his lap with a familiarity that still felt new and thrilling. His arms came around her automatically, holding her close. "He doesn't need to know," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. He's getting his life back. That's what matters." "And what about your life?" "This is my life now." He searched her face, looking for regret or resentment. Finding neither, he kissed her, slow and deep and full of gratitude she felt in her bones. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her lips. "Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway." Asterisk asterisk if your heart's racing too. Take a breath. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below for more unforgettable love stories. Asterisk asterisk. The threat he'd warned her about never materialized. Or rather, it did, but was handled so efficiently that she only learned about it after the fact. Quiet meetings, quieter resolutions, money changing hands or threats exchanged or whatever currency his world traded in. "Is it over?" she asked when he told her. "For now. These things are never truly over, but the immediate danger has passed." "So I could leave? If I wanted to?" His expression shuttered, pain flickering across his features before he controlled it. "Yes. The original terms of our agreement, they are fulfilled. Your brother's treatment is complete. You're free to go." She tilted her head, studying him. "Is that what you want?" "What I want and what's best for you aren't the same thing. Stop trying to make my decisions for me." "Elara, do you want me to leave?" He closed his eyes, jaw working. "No. God, no. I want you to stay forever. I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. I want—" He stopped, opened his eyes, and the rawness in them nearly broke her. "But you deserve better than this. Better than hiding in danger and a man who's done things he can never take back." She rose from his lap, took his hand, pulled him to standing, led him from his office, through the house, up the stairs to her room, the room that had once felt like a prison and now felt like home. "Tell me again," she said, closing the door behind them. "Tell me what you want." "I want you to stay." "Then I'm staying. Not because I have to. Not because I owe you. But because I love you. Because this, she gestured around the room, but meant something larger, is where I choose to be. His control shattered then, and he pulled her against him with a force that would have frightened her once. Now it just felt like safety, like coming home to a place she'd been searching for without knowing it. They made love that night with an urgency born of almost loss, of the realization that freedom had never been about leaving but about choosing to stay. He was gentle and rough by turns, reverent and desperate, and she met him with equal intensity, claiming him as thoroughly as he claimed her. After, as they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like them, he traced patterns on her skin and spoke in the darkness. I need to tell you something. About who I really am. What I've really done. Dante. No. If you're staying, if this is real, you need to know everything. Not the sanitized version. Not the parts one think you can handle. Everything. So he told her. About the first deal that crossed from legal to less so. About the man who'd threatened his mother and how Dante had made sure that man never threatened anyone again. About the empire built on necessity and violence and the kind of choices that stain your hands but keep you alive. He told her about the people he'd hurt, the lines he'd crossed, the moments when he'd looked in the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. About the cost of power and the price of survival and the weight of knowing that his success was someone else's failure, someone else's loss, someone else's grave. He laid it all out like evidence, like sins needing confession, like he was giving her one last chance to run. When he finished, the room was thick with silence and truth. Say something, he whispered. She was quiet for a long moment, processing, feeling the weight of what he'd shared. Then, thank you. For what? For trusting me with this. For not trying to protect me from who you really are. And you can still, after everything I've told you. She turned in his arms, met his eyes in the darkness. I'm not naive, Dante. I knew you weren't a saint. Saints don't have the kind of money you have, don't have the kind of power you wield. I knew there were things you'd done, choices you'd made. Knowing the details doesn't change how I feel. How can it not? Because I love you, not the version of you that you wish you were, not some fantasy of a better man. You, scars and sins and all the parts you think make you unlovable. I love the man who saved my brother, the man who protects people he cares about, the man who kisses me like I'm something precious even though his hands have done terrible things. I love you. He broke then, the walls finally crumbling, and he held her while something in him shook loose, grief or relief or the release of burdens carried too long alone. I love you, he said, voice rough with emotion. I love you so much it terrifies me. Then be terrified with me, she whispered, because I'm not going anywhere. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who'd found home in the most unlikely place, in the ruins of a deal made in desperation and the slow-burning realization that sometimes cages open from the inside. And sometimes, freedom looks like choosing to stay. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe in a new rhythm. The estate remained their sanctuary, but now it was something chosen rather than enforced. Elara moved through the rooms with different eyes, seeing not restriction but refuge, not imprisonment but protection freely given. Dante showed how parts of his business, the legitimate parts, the deals made in daylight with lawyers present and contracts that would stand up to scrutiny. He wanted her to understand. She realized that not everything he touched turned dark, that there were pieces of his empire built on honest work and fair trades, that the man he'd become was more complex than simple labels allowed. She met some of his associates, carefully chosen, thoroughly vetted. They treated her with respect that bordered on deference, as if her presence at Dante's side conferred status they recognized and honored. It should have felt strange. Instead, it felt inevitable. Mrs. Hale softened completely, began calling her dear, and leaving flowers in her room with the same care she'd once reserved for Dante's quarters. Teresa taught her to cook the dishes Dante loved, sharing recipes like secrets, like love made edible. Robert nodded to her each morning with something approaching warmth, and once, when she asked about his family, he actually smiled. The household had accepted her, More than that, they'd claimed her as one of their own. Her brother came to visit finally, healthy enough to travel, curious enough to insist. She'd been nervous for weeks leading up to it, rehearsing lies and half-truths, preparing for questions she couldn't honestly answer. Dante had been calm, almost amused by her anxiety. "Just introduce me as your boyfriend," he'd said. "It's not even a lie. My boyfriend who lives in an estate with armed guards and a household staff. Your boyfriend who's done very well in import-export and takes security seriously. Also not technically a lie, though the truth it danced around was vast enough to drown in." When her brother arrived, young and vital and so beautifully alive, Elara cried without meaning to. He hugged her tight, laughing, whole in ways she'd been terrified she'd never see again. "You saved me," he whispered in her ear. "I know what you gave up. I know what it cost." She pulled back, searched his face. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward where Dante stood a respectful distance away, giving them space for their reunion. "He told me about the debt, the deal, all of it." Her heart stopped. "When?" "Last week. He called me, said if I was going to visit, I deserved to know the truth." Her brother's eyes were bright with unshed tears and fierce gratitude. "He said you traded your freedom for my life, that you walked into his wild, blind, and desperate, and he took advantage of that desperation. Those were his exact words. Took advantage." He sounded ashamed. Elara looked over at Dante, saw him watching them with an expression that held fear and hope in equal measure. "What did you say to him?" she asked her brother. "I thanked him. For helping. For protecting you. For being smart enough to fall in love with you and lucky enough that you loved him back." "He told you that too." Her brother grinned. "Didn't have to. It's written all over both of you." The visit went better than Elara had dared hope. Her brother charmed the entire household, won over even the stoic guards with his easy humor and genuine warmth. He and Dante got along with surprising ease, finding common ground in sports and music and the kind of comfortable silence that suggested mutual respect. On his last evening, they had dinner together, the three of them and Mrs. Hale, who'd insisted on joining and brought out wine that cost more than most people's mortgages. "To second chances," her brother toasted, raising his glass, "and to the people who make them possible." They drank, and Elara felt something settle in her chest, a rightness that came from worlds colliding and not only surviving but blending into something new. After her brother left, as they stood in the driveway watching his car disappear down the long drive, Dante pulled her close. "He's good," he said. "You did well raising him. You told him everything. I thought you wanted it kept secret. I wanted you safe. I wanted him safe. But I realized that secrets are their own kind of prison. And I'd promised you freedom." She turned in his arms, looked up at him. "You gave me something better than freedom. You gave me choice." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises neither of them voiced but both understood. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to autumn, leaves turning colors that Juan raked into piles and burned, the smoke carrying memories up into cooler air. Elara's life found its rhythm in Dante's world, and slowly that world became his too. She started working again, not at the hospital, but at a clinic Dante funded in the city's poorest district. He'd never mentioned it to her, this piece of charity done quietly, without fanfare. She discovered it by accident, found the financial records while looking for something else entirely. When she confronted him about it, he'd shrugged. "Money's just numbers until you do something useful with it." She volunteered there 3 days a week, nursing skills, finding purpose again, making a difference in ways that felt immediate and real. The work reminded her of who she'd been before Dante, before desperation, before everything changed. But it also showed her who she'd become, someone stronger, more certain, more capable of holding darkness and light simultaneously without being consumed by either. Dante would sometimes pick her up after her shifts, the expensive car looking out of place among the neighborhood's poverty. But the kids loved it, would gather around to admire while she gathered her things, and Dante would let them climb in, show them the features, treat them like they mattered. "You're good with them," she observed once, watching him explain the sound system to a 7-year-old with reverent intensity. "I was one of them once," he said simply. "I remember what it meant when someone treated me like I was worth their time." She fell in love with him again in those moments, the small kindnesses that cost him nothing but meant everything. ***, before we close this chapter, take a moment, like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below. Every small gesture helps the next story find its way to you. Winter arrived with unexpected intensity, snow blanketing the estate in white that muffled sound and transformed the familiar into something otherworldly. They stayed inside more, the house warm and close, the world beyond its walls feeling distant and irrelevant. One evening, curled together on the couch in his private study, fire crackling and wine glasses nearly empty, Dante said something that changed everything. "Marry me." She thought she'd misheard. "What?" He shifted, turned to face her properly, pulled a box from his pocket. Black velvet, small, ominous in its implications. "Marry me," he repeated. "Not because you owe me. Not because you're grateful or trapped or any of the 1,000 wrong reasons you could say yes. Marry me because you love me. Because you want to wake up next to me for the next 50 years. Because this thing we've built together is worth making permanent." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, elegant, a single stone that caught the firelight and threw it back transformed. "I know my world is complicated. I know I come with dangers and moral ambiguities and a past that would make saints weep. I know I have no right to ask you to tie yourself to all of that permanently. But I'm asking anyway. Because you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Because loving you has made me want to be better than I am. Because—" She kissed him, stopping the words because her answer was already written in the way she melted against him, in the tears streaming down her face, in the yes that broke from her lips like a prayer. "Yes," she said again, clearer. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and they sat there in the firelight, holding each other, two people who'd found their way to forever through the strangest path imaginable. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "You say that a lot." "Because it's true." She pulled back, cupped his face in her hands. "Then spend the rest of your life earning me. Spend it being the man I see when I look at you. Not perfect, not without sin, but trying. Always trying." "I can do that." "Then that's all I need." They made love that night in front of the fire, slow and reverent, sealing promises with touch and breath and the kind of intimacy that goes deeper than flesh. And when morning came, cold and bright through the windows, they woke tangled together, engaged, committed, terrifyingly and beautifully certain. The wedding planning began immediately. Mrs. Hale took charge with military precision. Teresa started experimenting with cakes. Robert quietly increased security because weddings, apparently, were vulnerable moments that enemies might exploit. Ilara's brother was thrilled, insisted on walking her down the aisle despite never having met their father who should have done it. Dante's few remaining family members, cousins mostly, distant but warm, sent their congratulations and promises to attend. And through it all, Ilara felt the shift completing, from captive to guest to lover to partner to this, the final transformation. Wife, not in name yet, but in every way that mattered. She was choosing this, choosing him, choosing a life that would never be simple but would always be theirs. And as winter deepened and the wedding date approached, she realized something fundamental. The cage had never existed. Not really. It had been an illusion made of fear and desperation and misunderstanding. The truth was simpler and more profound. She'd been free all along. Free to leave. Free to stay. Free to love a man who'd saved her and then shown her how to save herself. Free to build a life in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely person, and call it home. The wedding was planned for spring, when the gardens would bloom with the kind of extravagance that matched the impossibility of their story. 3 months away. Enough time for preparations, for adjustments, for the reality of what they were doing to settle into their bones. But those 3 months brought more than just wedding plans. Dante's world, which had seemed stabilized, began to shift in ways that set his jaw tight and brought shadows back to his eyes. Deals fell through. Shipments were delayed. Associates who'd been loyal for years suddenly became evasive, their explanations too smooth, too rehearsed. "Something's wrong," he told her one night, pacing his study while she watched from the doorway. "The pieces are moving, but I can't see the pattern yet." Could it be related to the threat from before? The one that brought me here? No, that was resolved. This is something new, or something old coming back. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. Some parts of his world she'd accepted would remain opaque, not because he didn't trust her, but because knowing certain things made you complicit in ways that love couldn't justify. But the tension bled into everything. He was gone more, meetings stretching into late nights and early mornings. When he was home, he was distracted, present in body but absent in mind, calculating scenarios she couldn't see but felt in the air between them. She tried to help by being steady, continuing her work at the clinic, managing the wedding details, maintaining normalcy in a household that could feel it slipping. Mrs. Hale worried visibly, her usual composure cracking around the edges. Robert doubled shifts again, brought in people Alara didn't recognize but who carried themselves with the kind of readiness that suggested combat experience. "Should I be worried?" she asked Dante one evening, finding him in his office at 2 a.m, papers spread across his desk like evidence of crimes uncommitted. He looked up, and the exhaustion in his face nearly broke her. "I won't let anything happen to you." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yes, you should be worried. Not for yourself. I'll die before I let anyone touch you. But for me. For this." He gestured at the papers, but she understood he meant his empire, his world, everything he'd built. "Someone's trying to take it, and I don't know who yet." She crossed to him, moved papers aside, sat on the edge of his desk. "Then we'll figure it out." "We?" "You think I'm marrying you just to become a widow 3 months later? Not a chance. Tell me what you need." What he needed, it turned out, was someone he could think out loud to. Someone who could listen without judgment, who could ask questions that weren't about profit margins or power plays, but about people, their motivations, their weaknesses, their patterns. She became his sounding board. Late nights in his office, going through names and histories, piecing together connections that his wild weariness had stopped seeing clearly. She brought a nurse's eye to it, the same skills that helped her diagnose patients applied to diagnosing betrayal. "It's someone close," she said one night, 3 weeks into their investigation. "Has to be. They know too much about your operations, your timing, your vulnerabilities." "I thought of that. But I've known these people for years, some of them decades. They're human," she interrupted gently. "And humans can be bought or threatened, or convinced that their loyalty should lie elsewhere. Who's changed recently? Who's acting different? Who's suddenly wealthier or more nervous?" He pulled up files, financial records, surveillance reports he probably shouldn't have shown her, but did anyway because transparency had become their foundation. They worked through the night, coffee going cold, the fire burning down to embers. And then she saw it. "There," she said, pointing to a name she'd seen 3 times in contexts that shouldn't overlap. "Who is he?" Dante leaned closer, studied the screen. His expression went carefully blank in a way that told her everything. "His name is Vincent Caruso. He's been my second for 8 years. My most trusted advisor. Is there any reason he'd turn on you?" "No. I've made him wealthy, powerful. He's been loyal through everything." "Then why is his signature on documents authorizing shipments you didn't approve? Why is he meeting with men who have no legitimate business with your organization? Why did his bank account receive 2 large deposits from untraceable sources in the last month?" Dante stayed at the screen like it held his betrayal in pixels and data points. "You're sure?" "I'm sure the pattern's there. whether it means what we think it means. But they both knew it did. The confrontation happened the next day. Dante called Vincent to the estate, a routine meeting that felt anything but. Ilara watched from the security feed in Dante's private office. He'd insisted she stay hidden, not wanting her anywhere near what was about to happen. Vincent arrived looking relaxed, confident. Walked into Dante's study like he owned part of it, which perhaps he'd thought he did. The conversation started cordial. Business updates, financial reports, the mundane machinery of empire maintenance. Then Dante laid out the evidence, each piece carefully, methodically, giving Vincent chances to explain, to justify, to lie. To his credit, Vincent didn't bother. When the truth became unavoidable, he simply smiled, cold and empty. "You've gotten soft," Vincent said, his voice clear even through the speakers. "Ever since you brought that woman here. She's made you weak. She's made me see clearly. There's a difference. You used to understand that power requires sacrifice, that loyalty is just another currency to be traded. That sentiment is a luxury men like us can't afford. Men like you, maybe. I'm trying to be something different." Vincent laughed. "Because of her? Because you think love changes anything? It doesn't. It just gives your enemies leverage." Ilara saw Dante's hands clench. "Who are you working for? Does it matter? Someone who sees opportunity in your weakness. Someone who knows that a man distracted by wedding plans and domestic bliss isn't paying attention to his empire crumbling. My empire is fine. For now. But how long before she asks you to go legitimate? To leave this world behind? How long before you choose her over everything you've built?" Vincent leaned forward. "She's your downfall, Dante. I'm just helping it along." What happened next was too fast for the cameras to capture clearly. Movement, violence, the sudden presence of Robert and his men. When the chaos settled, Vincent was on his knees, blood dripping from his split lip, hands secured behind his back. Dante crouched in front of him, voice low and lethal. "You're right about one thing. She has changed me, made me more dangerous, not less. Because now I have something worth protecting, something worth killing for." He stood, looked at Robert. "Take him. Get everything, names, accounts, plans, all of it. Then make sure he understands what happens to people who threaten what's mine." Vincent was dragged out, still smiling despite the blood, despite knowing what was coming. Ilara watched until the screen went dark, then sat in the silence of Dante's office, processing what she'd seen, what she'd contributed to. When Dante came to find her an hour later, she was still sitting there. "Are you all right?" he asked, sinking into the chair across from her. "I helped you identify a man who's going to die because of it." "No, he's going to die because he betrayed me, because he chose to hurt what's mine. You just helped me see the truth faster." "Does that distinction matter?" He was quiet for a moment. "To me, yes. But I understand if it doesn't to you." She looked at him. This man she loved, who'd just ordered someone's death with the same voice he used to tell her he loved her. The duality should have terrified her, should have sent her running. Instead, she just felt tired. "I knew," she said finally. "When I agreed to stay, when I said I'd marry you, I knew what your world required. Knew that loving you meant accepting all of it, the violence, the moral ambiguity, the fact that sometimes people die because that's the cost of keeping what's yours safe. That doesn't make it easier. No, but it makes it bearable." He crossed to her, knelt in front of her chair, took her hands. "Say the word and we leave. All of this, the business, the empire, everything. We disappear. I have enough money stashed away that we could live comfortably for 10 lifetimes. Say the word, Ilara, and I'll walk away from all of it." She searched his face, so that he meant it, that he would burn his kingdom down if she asked, leave behind everything he'd built, become someone new. The offer was tempting, easy, safe. She didn't take it, No, she said softly. This is your world. Your life's work. I won't ask you to destroy it. I'll just ask you to be careful. To be smart. To come home to me every night so we can carry the weight of it together. Relief and pain warred in his expression. You're sure? I'm sure. He pulled her into his arms, held her like she was the only solid thing in a world gone fluid and dangerous. I love you. God, I love you. I know. That's why I'm staying. They sat there on the floor of his office, wrapped around each other, while somewhere in the building Vincent was giving up names and secrets, while the Empire stabilized itself through interrogation and force, while the world kept turning in the violent, beautiful way it always had. And Ilara understood, finally, completely, loving Dante meant loving all of it. The danger and the safety, the darkness and the light, the man who saved her brother and the man who ordered executions with cold efficiency. It meant choosing, every day, to stay in a world that would never be simple. It meant being strong enough to stand beside him while he did what needed doing. It meant building a life on foundations that others would call unstable, and calling it home anyway. If stories like this linger in your heart long after they end, don't leave just yet. Like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below, and let the next story find you when the night grows quiet again. Spring came despite everything. The gardens bloomed on schedule, indifferent to human drama. The wedding approached with its own momentum, carrying them forward whether they felt ready or not. Vincent's betrayal had been dealt with, quietly, efficiently, in ways Ilara didn't ask about. The conspirators he'd named were handled similarly. The Empire stabilized, gaps filled, lessons learned. Dante seemed lighter afterward, as if exposure and resolution of the threat had lifted weight he'd been carrying. He smiled more, laughed easier, found time for the small things they'd been neglecting, morning walks through the awakening gardens, late dinners that stretched into midnight, stolen moments that felt like the calm after storms they'd weathered together. And then, 1 month before the wedding, everything changed again. But this time, it wasn't a threat from outside. This time, it came from within. Ilara missed her period. At first, she dismissed it. Stress, she told herself. The upheaval of Vincent's betrayal, the wedding preparations, the constant low-grade anxiety of living in Dante's world. Bodies responded to stress in predictable ways. But when the second week passed, then the third, dismissal became impossible. She bought a test from a pharmacy in the city during one of her clinic shifts. Took it in the bathroom there, hands shaking, heart hammering against her ribs with a force that felt like panic and hope intertwined so tightly she couldn't separate them. 2 lines. Positive. She stared at the test, watching the lines darken with chemical certainty, and felt her entire world tilt on its axis. A baby. She was carrying Dante's child. The implications crashed over her in waves. A child raised in this world, surrounded by gods and danger and moral complexity. A child who would inherit not just Dante's name but his empire, his enemies, his choices. A child who would grow up knowing that love sometimes wore the face of violence, that safety required sacrifice, that family was both blessing and liability. She should tell him immediately, should share this news that would change everything. Instead, she sat in the bathroom of a clinic that served the city's poorest, test clutched in trembling hands, and cried, for joy, for fear, for the weight of future she couldn't predict. She composed herself eventually, returned to work, went through the motions of patient care with automatic precision while her mind spun through scenarios and possibilities. Drove home in afternoon light that seemed too bright, too normal for a day when everything had fundamentally shifted. Dante was in his study when she arrived, and the sight of him, bent over papers, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses he hated wearing perched on his nose, nearly broke her composure again. "You're home early," he said, looking up with a smile that transformed his face from dangerous to devastating. "Everything okay at the clinic?" "Fine. I just needed to come home." He studied her, and she watched recognition dawn in his eyes, that gift he had for reading her, for seeing beneath surfaces to the truth beneath. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She stopped, breathed, tried again. I need to tell you something. The smile faded. He set down his pen with deliberate care, removed the glasses, gave her his full attention. Tell me. She crossed to his desk, pulled the test from her purse, set it between them. Let the plastic stick speak what her voice couldn't quite manage. He stayed at it, looked up at her, back down at the test. She watched emotions flicker across his face too fast to name. Shock, certainly. Fear, maybe. And then something else, something that made her chest tight with hope. You're pregnant? Yes. With my child. There hasn't been anyone else, Dante. So yes, definitely yours. He stood slowly, came around the desk like a man approaching something precious and fragile. Stopped in front of her, hands hovering as if afraid to touch her, afraid she might break. How long have you known? 20 minutes. I came straight home. And how do you feel about it? The question was careful, neutral, giving her space to be honest. She loved him for it. Terrified, she admitted, and happy, and completely overwhelmed. A baby, Dante. In this world, with everything that comes with it. We don't have to, he said quietly. If you don't want this, if the timing's wrong or the circumstances aren't right, I'll support whatever you choose. She'd expected that, appreciated it, but hearing him offer her the out made her realize she didn't want it. I want this baby, she said. Our baby. Even though it's complicated and scary and might be the most irresponsible thing we could possibly do. I want it anyway. The fear in his expression cracked, letting through something raw and beautiful. You're sure? I'm sure. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, hands finally touching her, palms flat against her stomach where the child was growing, too small yet to feel but present nonetheless. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. I'm going to be a father. You're going to be a father. I don't know how. My own father, who was barely there, and when he was usually drunk or angry or both. I don't know what a good father looks like. She took his face in her hands. Then we'll figure it out together. Make mistakes, learn from them, try to do better than what we had. That's all anyone does. What if I mess it up? What if I'm too much like him, or too damaged from this life, or... Then you'll mess it up and we'll fix it. Dante, you're not your father. You're not defined by where you came from or what you've done. You're defined by what you choose to do next. And I've seen you make good choices, kind choices, loving choices. You'll be a good father. You don't know that. I know you. That's enough. He held her for a long time, there in his study, while the news settled and transformed them from engaged couple to expectant parents. When he finally released her, his expression had shifted, harder, more determined. Everything changes now, he said. The security, the precautions, all of it. I need to protect you both. Dante. No arguments. I won't risk this. Won't risk you or our child. Whatever it takes. She saw the shift happening, the softness of the moment calcifying into strategy, into the cold calculation that kept them safe but sometimes felt like suffocation. She understood it, even appreciated the fierce protectiveness driving it. But she also knew she needed to push back. I'm not made of glass. I can still work, still live, still be myself. A baby doesn't make me fragile. It makes you precious, more precious than before, if that's possible. I was already precious to you. And now there's two of you. Can you understand what that means to someone like me? I have something to lose. Two somethings. The idea of anything happening to either of you. His voice broke, and she understood. In his world, love was liability. Family was weakness enemies exploited. Every person you cared about was a potential weapon turned against you. Then we make it strength, she said firmly. This baby, this family, will make it the reason you're more careful, more strategic, more protected. Not the reason you're vulnerable. He nodded slowly. You're right. You're right. I know. But we're in this together, remember? Whatever comes, we face it as a team. As a family. As a family. The wedding preparations took on new urgency. They moved the date up, not because they had to, she wasn't showing yet, but because neither wanted to wait any longer than necessary. 6 weeks instead of the planned 3 months. Mrs. Hale rallied magnificently, compressing timelines with military efficiency. Teresa adjusted menu plans for Alara's changing appetite, sudden aversions to food she'd loved, cravings for things she'd never particularly cared about. Robert implemented new security protocols that turned the estate into something approaching a fortress without looking like one. And Dante transformed from protective to something approaching paranoid. She found him one night, 3 weeks after learning about the baby, sitting in what would become the nursery, a room they'd chosen together, 3rd floor, eastern exposure, overlooking the gardens. He was just sitting in the empty space, staring at walls that would soon hold their child's future. Couldn't sleep? She asked from the doorway. He looked up, and in the dim light from the hallway, he looked younger, vulnerable. I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong. The pregnancy, the delivery, raising a child in this world. The list is endless, and every scenario ends with me failing you both. She crossed to him, maneuvered her way into his lap despite the awkwardness of new curves her body was developing. You're catastrophizing. I'm being realistic. You're being scared, which is normal. I'm scared too. You don't look scared. You look radiant. She laughed despite the heaviness of the moment. That's the pregnancy hormones. Trust me, underneath the glow, I'm terrified. Of what? Everything you're afraid of, plus more. What if I'm a terrible mother? What if I can't protect them from your world? What if loving them isn't enough? It will be enough. You're already enough. And so are you. She kissed him softly. We're going to figure this out. Make mistakes, yes. Face dangers, absolutely. But we'll do it together, and that makes all the difference. He held her in the empty room that would soon cradle their child, and slowly, she felt his fear transmute into something more useful. Not gone, it would never be fully gone, but managed, channeled, transformed into the fierce protectiveness that would keep them all safe. The wedding happened on a perfect spring day, when the gardens exploded with color and the air smelled of possibility. Small ceremony, intimate, just family and the few people who'd become family through proximity and choice. Her brother walked her down the aisle made of rose petals, his hand steady on her arm, his eyes bright with joy for her. Mrs. Hale cried despite her best efforts to maintain composure. Teresa dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Robert stood guard even during the ceremony, but she could have sworn she saw him smile. And Dante, waiting for her at the altar set up in the garden, looked like a man receiving redemption he didn't deserve but would fight to keep anyway. The vows they'd written themselves, nothing traditional, everything honest. Promises to love through darkness and light, through danger and safety, through all the complicated reality their life demanded. When he kissed her, sealing their marriage, she tasted salt from tears she wasn't sure belonged to him or her or both. The reception was elegant and warm, food that tasted like home and love made edible, wine she couldn't drink but didn't mind abstaining from. They danced in the garden while the sun set and stars emerged, and for one perfect evening, nothing else mattered. That night, in their bed, officially theirs now, she'd moved into his room weeks ago. He held her with a gentleness that bordered on worship. Mrs. Moetti, he murmured against her skin. Still sounds strange. You'll get used to it. And what about when baby Moetti arrives? Will we get used to that too? He placed his hand over her stomach, where the smallest curve had started to become visible. I don't think I'll ever get used to this. To you. To the fact that you chose this life, chose me, chose to build a family in the ruins of everything I am. not ruins. Foundations. We're building on foundations, Dante. Strong ones. He made love to her slowly, carefully, conscious of the life growing between them, treating her body like something sacred. And maybe they both were, two people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances, who'd built love from desperation, who were now creating new life from that love. After, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, she felt their baby move for the first time, just a flutter, easy to miss, but unmistakable once recognized. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. "What?" She took his hand, placed it where the movement had been, waited. There, again. Stronger this time. His breath caught. "Is that our baby saying hello?" He was silent for a long moment, hand pressed against her skin, feeling their child's first communications with the outside world. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Hello, little one. We're here. We're waiting. And we're going to do everything we can to give you a good life." Elara closed her eyes, let tears slip free, and thought, This is what freedom looks like. Not the absence of cages, but the presence of choice. Not escaping danger, but facing it with someone who makes the risk worthwhile. This is what love looks like, imperfect, complicated, built on foundations that others might call unstable, but strong enough to hold them all. Pregnancy transformed Elara in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not just physically, though her body changed daily, curves softening, belly rounding with beautiful inevitability, but emotionally, mentally. She felt simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable, as if carrying life made her both invincible and fragile. Dante watched her with constant fascination, tracking every change with an intensity that would have been overwhelming if it weren't so tender. He talked to her stomach when he thought she was sleeping, telling their child stories about the world they'd be born into, promises about protection and love and all the things he'd never had but would make sure they did. She worked at the clinic through her second trimester, refusing to be sidelined by pregnancy. The patients loved seeing her change, would touch her belly with gentle hands and share their own stories of motherhood, the joy, the terror, the ways children remake you from the inside out. But as she entered her third trimester, complications emerged. Nothing dramatic at first, just elevated blood pressure during a routine check. The doctor recommended rest, reduced stress, monitoring. All reasonable suggestions that clashed fundamentally with the life she'd built. Dante went into protective overdrive, insisted she stop working, stay home, let the household care for her. She resisted, not because she didn't understand his concern, but because surrendering her independence felt like losing herself. They fought about it, voices raised in ways they'd avoided since falling in love. He argued from fear disguised as logic. She argued from stubbornness disguised as principle. Neither was entirely wrong, which made resolution impossible. Mrs. Hale finally intervened, pulling them both aside separately and reading them truths they needed to hear. To Dante, she's not yours to control. She's yours to love and support. There's a difference. To Elara, pride is wonderful until it endangers what you're trying to protect. Let him help you. Let us all help you. They compromised. She stopped working at the clinic but continued consulting from home, reviewing files, advising on difficult cases, maintaining connection to work that gave her purpose. Dante relaxed his most stringent restrictions, learning to channel his fear into useful action rather than suffocating control. The nursery came together slowly, lovingly. They chose furniture together, crib that looked antique but met modern safety standards, changing table that Dante assembled himself despite having staff who could have done it better, rocking chair that Mrs. Hale contributed with the admission that it had been hers when her own children were young. Walls painted a soft sage green, curtains that filtered sunlight into gentle gold, mobile hanging above the crib featuring stars and moons that Robert had carved by hand in his rare free hours. The room filled with love made tangible, with hope given shape. Elara's brother visited monthly, bringing energy and humor that lightened the household's intensity. He and Dante had developed genuine friendship, bonding over anticipation of the baby's arrival, over plans for the child's future, over the ways family could be chosen as much as inherited. "You're going to be an uncle," Elara told him during one visit, watching him hold tiny clothes with wonder. "And you're going to be an amazing mom," he replied. "Though I'm terrified for any teenager who tries to date your kid. Between you and Dante, that poor child won't have a normal adolescence." "Normal is overrated," says the woman married to her. He stopped, glanced around, lowered his voice. "You know." She did know. The fact that her brother still struggled to name Dante's profession, even now, was oddly endearing. "Says the woman who's happy," she corrected gently. "That's what matters." But happiness, she was learning, coexisted with fear in ways that pregnancy amplified. Every doctor's appointment brought potential for complications. Every kick that came slightly weaker or differently positioned sparked worry that took hours to ease. Every news story about dangers to children made her want to wrap her baby in protective layers before they were even born. And underneath it all, the constant awareness, she was bringing a child into a world that had tried to kill their father multiple times, that still contained enemies who would see opportunity in an infant who carried the Moetti name. Robert increased security further. Guards who'd been present but subtle became obvious, ever present. The estate, which had felt like sanctuary, began to feel like fortress again, protection and prison bleeding together. She mentioned it to Dante one evening, 7 months pregnant and uncomfortable in every position, trying to find rest that eluded her. "I feel trapped again," she admitted, "like when I first came here. All the walls and guards and restrictions." His expression twisted with pain. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to keep you safe without." "I know, and I understand. But understanding doesn't make it easier." He was quiet for a moment. Then, after the baby comes, after the first year when they are most vulnerable, we'll reevaluate. Maybe move somewhere quieter, less visible, somewhere you can breathe. Would you really leave all this? For you? For our child? In a heartbeat. She believed him, but she also knew his empire wasn't something he could simply walk away from. Power demanded maintenance. Absence created vacuums that enemies filled. Leaving meant either careful transition or violent collapse. "We'll figure it out," she said, her solution to every impossible problem. "We always do." The baby decided to arrive 3 weeks early, in the middle of a thunderstorm that shook the house and turned the gardens into rivers. Labor started gently, contractions that felt like practice, cramping that could have been anything. She almost ignored it, might have if Mrs. Hale hadn't noticed her discomfort and insisted on timing the intervals. "Oh," the older woman said, after 20 minutes of observation. "Oh, dear. We need to go. Now." The hospital was 30 minutes away in good weather. In the storm, with roads flooding and lightning splitting the sky, it might as well have been across the world. Dante drove with controlled panic, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, jaw set in determination, while Robert followed in another car with additional security because even childbirth required protection. Elara breathed through contractions that came faster, harder, stealing breath and reason. Pain she'd witnessed in others but never fully understood until it lived in her own body. They made it to the hospital with minutes to spare. She was rushed to delivery, Dante beside her, still in the clothes he'd worn to dinner, looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him face down armed men. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. "It's too much. I can't." "You can," he said firmly, one hand gripping hers, the other stroking her hair. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived desperation, survived my world, survived loving me. You can do this." The doctor arrived, nurses bustling with efficient care, and then there was no more room for doubt or fear. Just pain and pushing and the overwhelming biological imperative to bring this child into the world. She screamed, cursed, begged for it to stop and for it to be over and for someone to explain why anyone ever did this voluntarily. Dante endured it all beside her, letting her break his hand with her grip, never flinching, never leaving, whispering encouragement and love and promises that tomorrow this would be memory and they'd have their child. And then, after hours that felt like lifetimes, a cry. Not hers, not Dante's, new, small, furious at this bright, cold world they'd been thrust into. It's a girl, the doctor announced, lifting a tiny, perfect human into view. You have a daughter. A daughter. Elara burst into tears as they placed the baby on her chest, warm, wet, screaming with healthy lungs and righteous indignation. She looked down at this impossible miracle, this person who'd grown inside her, who was part her and part Dante and entirely herself. Hello, she whispered. Hello, sweet girl. We've been waiting for you. Beside her, Dante made a sound she'd never heard from him, something between sob and laugh, broken with emotion too vast for words. He touched their daughter with shaking fingers, tracing her tiny face, her impossibly small hands, her shock of dark hair. She's perfect, he breathed. God, she's perfect. They named her Sophia, for wisdom, for strength, for the hope that she'd be both in a world that would demand it. The next hours passed in exhausted haze, nurses checking vitals, Sophia nursing with surprising determination, visitors arriving and leaving in careful rotation. Her brother came bearing flowers and tears. Mrs. Hale appeared with gifts wrapped in elegance. Robert brought a teddy bear that looked absurd coming from someone so dangerous, but his eyes were soft when he looked at the baby. Through it all, Dante barely left their side. He held Sophia with terrified reverence when Elara needed rest, learning to support her head, to recognize her different cries, to change diapers with the same focus he brought to business negotiations. Late that first night, when the hospital had quieted and Sophia slept in the bassinet beside Elara's bed, Dante sat in the chair pulled close, watching them both with an expression that broke her heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I don't deserve this, either of you. That somewhere along the way I made choices that should have disqualified me from happiness like this. And yet here we are." "Here you are," he corrected. "You're the miracle. You and Sophia. I'm just the man lucky enough to be loved by you." She reached for his hand. "You're her father, my husband, the man who made all this possible. Stop acting like you're just adjacent to our lives. You're the center of them." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her palm, her wrist, the ring that marked her as his. "I'm going to be a good father. I swear it. She'll never doubt she's loved, never question that she's wanted, never feel like she's anything less than the greatest gift I've ever received." "I know." "How can you know? How can you trust me with something so precious when you've seen what I'm capable of?" "Because I've also seen what you're capable of when you love something, and that's more powerful than any darkness you carry." He stood, bent over the bed, kissed her with tenderness that tasted like tears. "Thank you. For her. For this. For believing I could be more than what I was. You were always more. I just helped you see it." They brought Sophia home 2 days later, to an estate transformed by her presence. The household had decorated, balloons and streamers that felt delightfully out of place among the expensive furnishings, a banner that read "Welcome Home" in Teresa's careful script. The staff gathered to meet her, this tiny human who'd changed everything without trying. They cooed appropriately, offered congratulations, then scattered to give the new family space to settle. That first night home, Sophia slept in the bassinet beside the bed, close enough that Elara could hear every breath, every small sound. Dante woke at each noise, checking on her with anxious frequency until Elara gently reminded him that babies made sounds and it was normal. "I'm terrified I'll miss something," he admitted. "That I won't hear her if she needs us." "Then we'll take turns, sleep in shifts, figure it out together." They did. Those first weeks were exhausting, nights bleeding into days, sleep becoming precious and rare, every moment consumed by the needs of someone so small she fit in the crook of Dante's arm but demanded their entire world. But underneath the exhaustion was joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy that came from watching Sophia discover existence, from her first smile, her first recognition of their faces, the way she'd grasped their fingers with strength that seemed impossible from someone so new. Dante proved himself the father he'd feared he couldn't be, patient during midnight feedings, calm during crying fits that seemed endless, devoted in ways that made Alara love him even more than she thought possible. And Sophia thrived, gained weight, hit milestones, developed personality that already showed flashes of both parents. Dante's determination, Alara's stubbornness, their combined capacity for love that felt boundless. Watching them together, her husband cradling their daughter, singing Orphic lullabies he'd learned from Mrs. Hale, making promises to protect and cherish and be worthy of her trust, Alara finally understood. The cage had never been about the estate's walls. It had been about fear. Fear of trusting, of loving, of believing that good things could last. But Sophia had shattered that cage completely. Because love, real love, didn't trap or limit or confine. It freed you to become more than you'd been. And watching Dante transform into a father, watching the household rally around this tiny person, watching life bloom in the most unlikely garden, Alara knew they'd built something that would last. Not despite the darkness in Dante's world, but because they'd chosen to create light within it. Sophia turned 6 months old on a day when autumn painted the gardens in shades of gold and rust, when the air carried hints of wood smoke and coming winter. The household celebrated with cake Teresa had made special. Though Sophia was too young to eat it, the symbolism mattered. She was sitting up now, reaching for things with purposeful intent, babbling in sounds that weren't quite words but carried meaning nonetheless. Her eyes had settled into gray that matched Dante's, though her temperament seemed to swing between her parents depending on mood and circumstance. Alara had returned to work at the clinic, just 2 days a week, needing that piece of herself that existed beyond mother and wife. Mrs. Hale watched Sophia on those days, and Dante had cut his schedule to be home more often. Business meetings conducted from home, trips postponed or delegated, priorities rearranged around the axis of his daughter. They'd found their rhythm as parents. Not perfect. Sophia had survived Dante's panic during her first fever, had endured Alara's anxious first trip away from home, had adapted to parents who sometimes got things wrong but always tried to get them right. But functional, loving, theirs. The estate had transformed further. Babe-approved corners, toys scattered in rooms that had once held only expensive furniture, the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing through halls that had known too much silence. The guards still patrolled. Security remained tight, but now they smiled when they saw Sophia, would wave at her during garden walks, had become unlikely but devoted protectors of this child who'd suffered the hardest among them. One afternoon, Robert found Alara in the garden while Sophia napped, concern written across features that usually revealed nothing. "Mrs. Moetti," he began, formal even after all this time, "there's something you should know." Her stomach dropped. "Is it Dante? Is he hurt?" No. He's fine. But there's been intelligence concerning individuals who've taken interest in Sophia." The world tilted slightly. What kind of interest? The kind that asks questions, watches patterns, maps vulnerabilities. Robert's voice was gentle but firm. "Nothing immediate. But Mr. Moetti needs to know people are aware of her, are tracking her routines." Alara felt cold despite the autumn sun. This is what he feared. Yes, but it's also why we're here. Why security exists. These people, they probe for weaknesses. When they find none, they move on. We just need to tighten protocols, vary schedules, be more careful. How careful? Careful enough to keep her safe without making her a prisoner. She appreciated the honesty. "Does Dante know?" "I'm telling him now. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you could process before he goes into full protection mode." Which he did, predictably. That evening, after Sophia had been fed and bathed and rocked to sleep, Dante laid out new security measures with the precision of military strategy. Increased guard rotations, armored vehicles for any off-estate travel, background checks on anyone who came within proximity of their daughter. "We're not changing our lives completely," he said, anticipating her objection. "But we're being smarter, more careful. I won't let anyone hurt her, Elara. I know, but I also won't let fear steal her childhood before it's barely begun." They found balance between his need to protect and her determination that Sophia experience life, not just survival. Day trips to parks with heavy security presence. Play dates with children whose parents had been thoroughly vetted. A life that tried to approximate normal while acknowledging their reality was anything but. Through it all, Sophia remained blissfully unaware. She grew and learned and loved with the wholehearted abandon of someone who didn't yet know the world could be dangerous. Her laughter rang through the estate. Her curiosity pulled them all into games and discoveries. Her presence reminded them daily what they were protecting and why it mattered. Elara's brother moved to the city, taking a job that let him visit weekly. He'd become uncle who spoiled Sophia shamelessly, bringing toys and books and an easy joy that counterbalanced the household's intensity. Watching him with Sophia, seeing how naturally he stepped into that role, Elara felt grateful they both survived to see this, family rebuilding from ruins, love expanding to include new generations. On Sophia's first birthday, they threw a party that felt like celebration of more than just her, of survival, of choices made and consequences weathered, of family forged in fires that should have destroyed them. Friends came, the few whose loyalty had been tested and proven. Mrs. Hale outdid herself with decorations. Teresa created a feast that accommodated both adult palates and Sophia's new but enthusiastic relationship with solid food. Robert and his team maintained security with efficiency that let everyone pretend, for a few hours, that they were just normal people celebrating a normal milestone. Sophia, overwhelmed by attention and sugar, alternately charmed guests and melted down with toddler drama that made everyone laugh. She destroyed her cake with gleeful abandon, got frosting in her hair, fell asleep mid-party in Dante's arms. Later, after guests had left and Sophia slept in her crib surrounded by new toys, Elara and Dante sat in the garden where they'd first admitted love, where so many of their crucial conversations had happened. "A year," Elara said softly. "It feels like yesterday and forever ago." "Best year of my life," Dante replied. Despite everything, the threats, the fear, the complications, still the best year. Because of how? Because of both of you. Sophia gave me purpose beyond power, but you gave me the foundation to be the father she deserves. He turned to her, took her hand. "I want more." "More what?" "More of this. More children, if you're willing. More years of chaos and joy and figuring it out together. More life built on what was started in desperation and turned into something beautiful." She felt tears prick her eyes. "You want more children, after seeing how terrifying it is." "Because I've seen how wonderful it is, and because I want Sophia to have siblings, to have family beyond us. I want to fill this house with noise and love and all the things I never had growing up. We'll have to build a fortress around each one. Then we'll build fortresses. We'll do whatever it takes." She kissed him, tasting hope and determination and the peculiar flavor of their life, equal parts danger and devotion. "Then yes, let's have more. Let's build the family neither of us had but both of us can give." They sat in the garden while stars emerged and autumn deepened around them, planning futures for children not yet conceived, dreaming of family that would grow to fill rooms and hearts with the kind of love that redeemed everything that came before. And somewhere inside, Sophia slept peacefully, unaware that she'd already changed the world simply by existing in it, unaware that her parents had met in desperation and despair, had built love from the ruins of separate lives, had created her in the space where darkness and light met and learned to coexist. She would learn those stories eventually, would understand the complexity of her heritage, the weight of her name, the reality that safety had been fought for and won daily by people who loved her before she drew breath. But for now, she simply existed, loved and protected, surrounded by family that had chosen each other as much as been born to each other, growing in gardens that violence had tried to claim but love had reclaimed instead. And that, Elara thought, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 3 years passed like water, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, but always moving forward. Sophia grew into a child full of questions and fearless curiosity, a miniature force of nature who ruled the household with charm and occasional tyranny. Her vocabulary exploded, her personality sharpened, and she developed the particular skill of wrapping both parents around her small fingers while making them think it was their idea. Twin boys followed when Sophia was 2, Luca and Marco, named for Dante's grandfather and father, carrying names that honored past while representing future. The pregnancy had been harder the second time, carrying 2 lives instead of 1, but the delivery went smoothly and suddenly their family had doubled in the way families sometimes do. The estate transformed further. The nursery became Sophia's big girl room, painted purple at her insistence, while the twins shared the room beside theirs. Toys multiplied exponentially. The household staff expanded to include nannies who helped during impossible hours when 2 infants demanded everything and Sophia required attention that came with being 3 and suddenly no longer the baby. Dante thrived in the chaos. He'd been terrified with Sophia, cautious and careful and constantly checking himself. With the twins, he was more confident, still protective, always watchful, but able to enjoy fatherhood in ways fear had prevented before. He'd leave meetings to get home for bedtime, would reschedule international calls to attend Sophia's dance recitals, had learned to function on minimal sleep and maximum coffee. His business evolved too. He'd started transitioning to more legitimate ventures, slowly divesting from operations that carried too much risk, investing in companies and properties that would provide for his family without requiring moral compromises he was no longer willing to make. It wasn't overnight, wasn't complete. There were still aspects of his empire that lived in gray areas, that required the kind of hardness he'd cultivated over decades. But he was moving toward light, drawn by children who deserved better than a father constantly looking over his shoulder. Elara returned to the clinic full-time once the twins were weaned, needing that piece of herself that existed beyond domestic life. She loved being mother and wife, found fulfillment in the daily chaos of raising 3 small humans. But the clinic reminded her she was also healer, helper, someone whose skills mattered beyond her family's walls. They'd hired staff to help manage the household, not because they couldn't handle it themselves, but because pretending they could would have meant sacrificing time and sanity they wanted to preserve for what mattered. Mrs. Hale had officially retired but remained in the estate's guest wing, unable to fully leave the family she'd helped build. Teresa still cooked, though now her meals accommodated picky toddlers and teething babies. Robert oversaw security that had become more sophisticated as the children made routine unpredictable. Life had settled into controlled chaos that felt more stable than any calm Elara had known before. Mornings were rushes of breakfast and dressing and getting everyone ready for day activities. Afternoons were naps for the twins, playground time for Sophia, stolen moments for adult conversation. Evenings were family dinners that rarely went according to plan, bath times that soaked floors, bedtime routines that required patience and occasional bribery. And nights, when all 3 children finally slept, were theirs, time to reconnect, to remember they were partners and lovers before they were parents, to maintain the foundation that held everything else up. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dante surprised her with a weekend away, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with Mrs. Hale and an army of support. They went to a cabin in the mountains, hours from the city, from the estate, from anything resembling their normal life. "I can't remember the last time we were alone for more than an hour," Elara admitted, sitting on the cabin's porch while sunset painted the sky in impossible colors. 7 months, Dante replied. "When your brother took Sophia for the weekend and the twins both got sick, we spent the entire time dealing with fevers and panic." "Romantic." He laughed, pulled her close. "I don't need romance. I just need you. Time where you're not Mom or Mrs. Moetti or Doctor. Just Elara." "I don't know if I remember how to be just Elara." "Then we'll figure it out together, like we figure out everything else." They spent the weekend remembering who they'd been before children, before marriage, before everything. Talked about dreams beyond diapers and school applications. Made love without worrying about little ones walking in. Slept past dawn because no one was crying or needing or demanding. It was glorious. It also made them both desperately miss their children by the second day. "We're hopeless," Ilara said, checking her phone for the 10th time to see photos Mrs. Hale had sent. "We finally get freedom and all we want is to go home." "That's not hopeless. That's love." Dante looked at the photo she was showing him, Sophia helping feed the twins, all three of them covered in what looked like mashed banana. "We built something good. Something worth missing." They returned home to chaos, Sophia launching herself at them with dramatic declarations of how much she'd missed them, the twins recognizing their parents and refusing to be put down, Mrs. Hale looking exhausted but pleased, the household clearly having survived but relieved they were back. "Never again," Mrs. Hale said, only half joking. 3 small children are too much for an old woman. But she smiled when she said it, and Ilara knew she'd loved every minute. Time continued its forward rush. Sophia started kindergarten, a milestone that hit both parents with unexpected emotion. The twins learned to walk within days of each other, doubling the household's chaos level as 2 toddlers careened through rooms that had seemed childproof until tested by determined twin energy. Dante's business transformation neared completion. He sold off the last of his questionable holdings, invested everything in legitimate ventures that would support his family for generations without requiring his children to inherit his complicated legacy. Some of his old associates understood. Others saw it as weakness, as betrayal of what they'd built together. There were threats. There always were. Men who felt abandoned or insulted, who saw Dante's transition as opportunity for takeover or revenge. Robert handled most of it before it reached Dante's attention. The few situations that escalated were dealt with firmly, finally, in ways that made clear the message: leave the family alone or face consequences that transcended business. Through it all, the children remained protected, largely unaware. Sophia noticed the guards but thought every family had them. The twins were too young to understand anything beyond their immediate world of toys and parents and the siblings they alternately adored and tortured. It was exactly what Dante and Ilara wanted: childhood insulated from reality, innocence preserved as long as possible. But they also knew it couldn't last forever. Sophia asked questions now. Why the house was so big. Why Daddy had people who followed him places. Why strangers sometimes took pictures when they went to parks or restaurants. Questions that required careful answers, truth filtered through age-appropriate language. Daddy's job is important, Ilara explained. And sometimes when people have important jobs, other people want to know about them. The guards help keep us safe in private. Safe from what? How to answer that? How to explain danger to someone who should only know safety? From people who might not understand that everyone deserves privacy. From situations that could be confusing or scary. Daddy, and I just want to make sure you and your brothers can play and grow without worrying about grown-up problems. Sophia seemed to accept this, her questions moving on to whether she could have a puppy and why the sky was blue and 1,000 other mysteries childhood presented. But the conversation stayed with Ilara, reminded her that their insulation from reality was temporary, that eventually their children would understand the full complexity of their heritage, would have to decide how to navigate a legacy built on both darkness and light. She mentioned it to Dante one evening, after the children were asleep and they sat in their bedroom reviewing the day's chaos. "They are going to figure it out eventually," she said. "Who you were, what you did, the empire you built before deciding to walk away from it." "I know. How do we prepare them for that?" He was quiet for a long moment. "We tell them the truth, I suppose. Not now, but when they are old enough to understand nuance. We tell them I made choices I'm not proud of, but those choices gave us the resources to make different choices now. We tell them that people are complicated, that good and evil aren't separate categories but tendencies that exist in everyone, and what matters is which ones we choose to cultivate. You've been thinking about this. Every day. How do I explain myself to my children? How do I ask them to love someone who's done things I wouldn't want them to know about? He looked at her, eyes shadowed with old guilt and new fear. What if they hate me when they learn the truth? They won't hate you. They'll struggle with it, probably. Have questions we might not be able to answer satisfactorily. But they'll also see the father who reads them bedtime stories, who bandages scraped knees, who shows up to every school event and makes silly voices for their stuffed animals. That's who you are now. That's who they know. And if that's not enough, then we'll figure it out together, like everything else. She took his hand, laced their fingers together. Our children are lucky, Dante. They have two parents who love them, who've built a life that gives them opportunities we never had. They have safety and stability and family that extends beyond blood. Whatever happens when they learn about your past, we'll handle it, as a family. He pulled her close, held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored. I love you. Good. I love you for believing I'm more than my mistakes. You are more. You've proven it every day since Sophia was born. Since before then, really. Since you decided one desperate woman's plea mattered more than your carefully maintained detachment. Best decision I ever made. Second best. What's the feist? Deciding to stay. After you gave me the option to leave. Choosing this life, this family, you. That was my best decision. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of partnership, from weathering storms together and coming out stronger on the other side. From their children's rooms came small sounds, Sophia talking in her sleep, one of the twins stirring before settling back down. The sounds of family, of life, of everything they'd built from foundations that should have crumbled but somehow held. And Elara thought, this is what freedom looks like. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of choice. Not escaping your past, but building a future that acknowledges it without being defined by it. This is what love looks like, complex and messy and requiring constant effort, but worth every moment of struggle. This is what home looks like, not a place, but people who choose each other daily, who build something together that's stronger than any individual component. And as she drifted towards sleep in Dante's arms, secure in the life they'd created, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would choose this, choose him, choose their family, every single time. 10 years after that first desperate meeting in Dante's office, Elara stood in the garden where so many crucial moments had unfolded, watching 3 children who carried their love forward into futures not yet written. Sophia was 13 now, poised on that precarious edge between childhood and whatever came next. She'd inherited Dante's intensity and Elara's compassion, a combination that made her both formidable and kind. She knew more about her father's past now. They'd told her the previous year, laying out truth with careful honesty when her questions became too pointed to deflect. She'd struggled with it, had been angry and confused and hurt that the father she adored had done things she couldn't reconcile with the man she knew. But she'd also seen how hard he worked to be better, how completely he'd transformed for his family. And eventually, after tears and difficult conversations and time to process, she'd come to him and said, I don't have to like everything about your past, but I love who you are now. That's what matters. The twins were 8, still young enough to see Dante as simply dad, uncomplicated by adult understanding of morality and consequence. They were different as night and day despite sharing everything from conception onward. Luca was quiet, thoughtful, drawn to books and puzzles. Marco was energy personified, constantly in motion, requiring 3 sports and daily outdoor time to even approach tired. Together, the 5 of them had built a life that worked. Not perfect, no life was, but functional, loving, theirs. Dante had fully transitioned out of his old world. The legitimate businesses he'd built thrived, providing more than enough to support the family and fund the charitable foundations he'd established, scholarships for kids from backgrounds like his own, grants for medical clinics in underserved areas, investments in programs that gave people options beyond desperation. He'd become, against all odds, respectable, still powerful, still commanding respect, but for different reasons now. People knew him as successful businessman, philanthropist, family man. The past existed, couldn't be erased, but it had been complicated by a present that contradicted simpler narratives. Ilara had advanced at the clinic, eventually becoming medical director. She split her time between administration and patient care, mentoring young nurses who reminded her of who she'd been, determined, compassionate, convinced they could make difference through sheer will and skill. Their life had rhythm now, predictability. Mornings remained controlled chaos. 3 children requiring different things at different times, everyone racing towards schools and obligations. But there was joy in the chaos, laughter amid the rush, small moments that made the difficulty worthwhile. Evenings were family dinners where they actually talked, where phones were banned and conversation ranged from Sophia's social dramas to the twins' competing stories about their days to Dante and Ilara's work challenges. They'd made it ritual, this daily connection, understanding that family was something you built consciously or lost unconsciously. Weekends alternated between quiet home time and adventures, hiking in mountains that reminded them of their anniversary trip, beach days where the twins tried to drown each other with loving enthusiasm, city museums where Sophia rolled her eyes at her parents' attempts at culture but secretly enjoyed herself. They'd found balance that had seemed impossible a decade ago, between Dante's world and normal life, between protection and freedom, between acknowledging darkness and choosing light. Mrs. Hale had passed 2 years prior, peacefully in her sleep at 87. The loss had gutted them all. She'd been more family than employee, more grandmother to the children than anything else. They'd buried her in the estate's garden, beneath roses she'd tended for decades, with a headstone that read simply, Mrs. Eleanor Hale. She made home wherever she was. Teresa still cooked, though she'd finally accepted help from younger staff who were learning her recipes and her fierce perfectionism. Robert had officially retired but lived in the guest house and remained unofficial advisor on security matters, unable to fully detach from family he'd protected for so long. The estate had become what Ilara had once only imagined it could be, not fortress, not prison, but home. The walls and guards existed still, practical realities of a past that couldn't be entirely left behind. But they no longer defined the space. The children's laughter did. The family dinners did. The ordinary magic of life fully lived did. On this particular afternoon, with Sophia reading in the shade and the twins playing some game that involved much running and shouting, Dante found Ilara in the garden. He'd aged well, gray threading through dark hair, lines around his eyes that came from laughter as much as stress, body still strong but softer around edges that fatherhood and contentment had relaxed. He slid his arms around her waist, pulled her back against his chest, rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing. How we got here from there. Long road. Worth it, though. Every mile." He was quiet for a moment, watching their children. "I think about that first night sometimes. You walking into my office, desperate and terrified and so damn brave. I think about how close I came to turning you away. It would have been easier, safer, smarter. But you didn't. No. Something in your eyes. I couldn't look away. Couldn't pretend I didn't see the desperation, the love for your brother that was big enough to make you walk into danger. I told myself I was just doing business, just making a deal. But I think I knew even then. This one was different. You were different." Ilara tined in his arms, looked up at him. "You saved my brother, built us a life, gave me a family I didn't know I needed. You saved me," he counted, "from becoming only what my choices had made me, from building empire without purpose, from forgetting there was more to existence than power and control. We saved each other then." "Yeah, we did." Sophia called out something to the twins, reminding them not to trample the roses, to be careful near the fountain. 13 going on 30, taking on responsibilities she didn't have to but chose to anyway. So much like both her parents, it was startling. "She's going to be okay," Ilara said, watching her daughter. "All of them are. We've given them enough foundation. The rest is up to them. And us? Are we going to be okay? She smiled. We're going to be better than okay. We're going to grow old together in this garden, watching our children become adults, maybe meeting grandchildren someday. We're going to look back on everything, the fear, the danger, the impossible circumstances that brought us together, and know it was worth it. Promise. Promise. He kissed her there in the garden where so much of their story had unfolded, gentle and deep and full of everything they'd built together. When they broke apart, the children were watching with various levels of disgust and amusement. Gross, Marco announced, making exaggerated gagging noises. That's what married people do, Sophia told him, though her expression suggested she found it equally embarrassing. When I grow up, Luca declared seriously, I'm never kissing anybody. We'll see, Dante replied, grinning. Your mom said the same thing once. I absolutely did not. You told Mrs. Hale that romance was a distraction you couldn't afford. She told me that story at least 6 times. The children laughed, delighted by this glimpse of their parents' history. They demanded more stories, wanted to know about the beginning, about how Mom and Dad had met. Dante and Alara exchanged glances. They told their children an edited version. Parents met through business arrangement, fell in love despite it. The full truth would come in time, piece by piece, as the children grew old enough to understand complexity and nuance. But for now, they shared safe stories, funny moments, sweet memories, the building blocks of family mythology that children needed to feel grounded in something larger than themselves. As the afternoon faded toward evening and the children scattered to various pursuits, Alara thought about that desperate woman who'd walked into a stranger's office 10 years ago. She'd been terrified, broken, convinced she was trading away freedom for her brother's life. She couldn't have known then what she knew now, that sometimes cages are illusions, that sometimes captivity is just another word for safety, that sometimes the most dangerous man is exactly who you need. That love doesn't require perfect circumstances, just perfect honesty. That family isn't always blood, but always choice. That the darkest nights sometimes lead to the brightest dawns. Somewhere in the city, there were still people who knew Dante's name, who remembered what he'd been. Somewhere there were files and records that documented choices he'd made, lines he'd crossed, the empire he'd built through force and will and whatever means necessary. But here, in this garden, with children who carried his name forward into futures they'd write themselves, with a woman who'd chosen him despite and because of everything he was, here, he was just Dante, husband, father, man trying daily to be worthy of the love he'd been given. And that, Alara knew, was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The garden settled into twilight. Sophia came to sit beside her mother on the bench. The twins collapsed in dramatic exhaustion nearby. Dante remained standing, surveying his kingdom, not the empire he'd built through violence, but this smaller, more precious domain of family and love and ordinary miracles. Tell me his name, Alara murmured, remembering that first conversation in his office, when she'd been too desperate to ask questions. Dante looked down at her, understanding the reference, the callback to their beginning. Dante Moetti, he said, husband to Alara, father to Sophia, Luca, and Marco, former many things, but trying to be better than all of them. And succeeding, she added softly. As darkness fell and stars emerged, they gathered their children and went inside, to dinner, to laughter, to the continuation of lives that had started in desperation and transformed into something neither had dared imagine. Behind them, the garden waited in silence, witness to everything they'd overcome, everything they'd become. Roses bloomed in darkness, perfume sweetening air that had seen violence and redemption, tears and triumph, endings that became beginnings. And if anyone had asked Alara in that moment whether she regretted walking into Dante's office, whether she'd choose differently if given the chance, the answer was simple. She'd choose this, every time, forever, because freedom, she'd learned, wasn't about escaping cages. It was about choosing who you locked yourself in with, and she'd chosen perfectly.